Chapter 1. The Dark Witch and the Hunter. The air in Oakhaven was not just cold. It was ancient. It smelled of wet granite, decaying oak leaves, and the kind of historical despair that never quite washed out of the soil. This was the town Elias Thorne knew that had hanged 3 women for witchcraft in 1698, and Oakhaven had been paying a spiritual penance ever since. Every October night here felt like standing on a slowly cooling pyre. Elias, cloaked in a thrift store coat that billowed satisfyingly when he moved, played the part of a lazy vampire hunter. His eyes, however, were sharp, taking in the details of the night with the practiced cynicism of a recent architecture graduate who hated parties. Beside him, Seraphina Vane Sarah was electric. She wore black velvet and leather, glitter woven into her dark hair like a captured galaxy. Her boots built to kick down doors or step on necks. The Dark Witch, her laughter, slightly brittle with the anxious energy she always carried, cut through the mounting tension of the night. 1 hour, Elias. 2 max. She shouted over the low, throbbing bass of the music already leaking from the house. Agreed. If it gets weird, we ghost. They were approaching the Blackwood Manor, a monstrosity of Victorian excess that locals claimed was built on the remains of the old parish church that had once housed the witch trials. Tonight, it was illuminated by sickly, throbbing orange floodlights, making the house look less like a party and more like a massive, cancerous organ. Fog machines choked the lawn, spitting out mist that tasted of chemical vanilla and damp earth. At the door, a student dressed as a scarecrow, his costume more convincing due to his slack jaw and drunken glaze, slapped black paper bracelets onto their wrists. "Open bar, kids. Welcome to hell," he slurred. The interior was a sensory violation. The strobe lights fired at a seizure-inducing frequency, slicing the smoke-filled air into sharp, disorienting fragments. Paper bats seemed to dive and writhe in the artificial heat. The smell was cloyingly sweet, spilled sugary punch and cheap synthetic body paint. A girl dressed as the Angel of Death was already sobbing on a velvet chaise lounge, while a guy in a full rubber ghoul suit tried to comfort her by offering her a shot from a glass syringe. "A cursed chapel indeed," Elias muttered, adjusting his collar. They found the bar, a massive stone fountain filled not with water, but with deep red punch. It glowed menacingly under a black light. They filled their plastic cups. Sarah took a sip, her eyes widening. "Oh, Elias, this is transcendent." The liquid was sweet, but beneath the sugar, there was a complex, deep flavor. Something earthy, metallic, and utterly addictive. Elias drank too, feeling a rush of warmth that was too immediate to be purely alcohol. "We might stay longer than 2 hours, Elias conceded, taking another deep gulp. They laughed, the sound already feeling distant. Sarah leaned in close, shouting over a song that sounded like pure static fed through a bass amplifier. "You owe me for the glitter, hunter." She pressed a quick, sweet kiss onto his cheek, leaving a faint, shimmering silver trace behind. She looked dangerously beautiful, and in that fractured, strobe-lit room, she looked entirely his. But the sweetness began to curdle. He took a third sip and his tongue went numb, a bitter aftertaste lingering. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was wrong. A wire of cold dread tightened in his spine. "Damn, this is strong," Sarah said, making a face, but she lifted her cup again anyway, the glittering light reflecting off the ruby liquid. "Seriously, what is in this?" Elias scanned the room, the urge to relax battling the sudden, overwhelming professional paranoia he hadn't known he possessed. That's when he saw them. Near the back wall, almost absorbed by the shadows, were the 3 men. The Pale Collective. They were completely out of place. No effort, no creativity. Just cheap, ill-fitting black hoodies and, most disturbingly, the masks. Not Ghostface. Not Michael Myers. These were blank, expressionless white plastic shells, the kind you might find for $1 in a forgotten bin. They had holes for the eyes and a simple, horizontal slit for a mouth. That was all. Pure, anonymous void. They weren't talking, weren't drinking, and weren't swaying to the bass. They were simply watching. Elias's jaw tightened. One of them, the tallest, had his featureless face aimed squarely at Sarah. He wasn't tracking her movements like a shy admirer. He was following her breathing, her pulse. He tracked her with the detached, clinical focus of a predator calculating distance. Friends of the host. Baked. Shy. Elias tried to rationalize, lifting his own cup. But the drink in his hand now tasted different again. A metallic, almost rusty flavor bloomed under the sugar. His fingertips felt tingly, heavy. He looked at Sarah, and she was blinking slowly, her head tilting slightly to the side, trying to follow the disjointed rhythm of the strobe. "Hey!" she said, her voice slow, syrupy. The word took a long time to reach him. A shadow drifted closer. One of the blank masks had moved silently from the wall, navigating the swarm of dancers with uncanny precision. Up close, the mask was even worse. The white plastic didn't catch the light. It seemed to absorb it, radiating a low, sickly glow. It was the purest embodiment of nullity. He didn't speak. He simply lifted one gloved hand and nodded toward Elias's cup, then toward Sarah's. A slow, approving nod. Elias instinctively slammed his cup down onto a nearby overturned keg. The sound was a loud, defiant thud in the sludge-like silence that had descended on his perception. The air thinned, becoming acidic. The music was no longer a beat. It was a rhythmic pounding that seemed to originate inside Elias's own chest. Sarah grabbed his wrist with a desperate, crushing grip. Her pupils were terrifyingly dilated, vast pools of black absorbing the strobe light. "What is this?" The words were barely a whisper, stretching and echoing down a long, psychological corridor. Across the room, the second Pale Collective member moved with an unsettling, smooth confidence. He carried a large, antique silver pitcher and was methodically topping off the drinks of the stumbling partygoers. People didn't question it. They cheered, unaware, and immediately swayed harder. Elias saw it happening in slow motion. A girl in an angel costume giggled, hiccuped, and simply folded herself onto the floor, her synthetic wings going instantly limp. A pirate collapsed into a beanbag chair, his tricorn hat sliding off, revealing a glazed, vacant look in his eyes. They were being culled. Methodically, efficiently. Elias met Sarah's eyes. Her signature confident smile was entirely gone, replaced by naked, primal terror. They understood each other instantly, the oldest language known to prey. Escape. They aimed for the stairs, the only route to the upper floors and potentially a window, a way out of the swarm. But the party surged. The drug made the floor feel like moving jelly, swelling and sinking with every step. People were slumping mid-laugh, mid-dance, their eyes becoming dull, glassine marbles. "Sarah," Elias rasped, the name itself a small anchor in the chaos. They fought their way through the suffocating crowd, Sarah's glitter streak across her cheek now looking like a warrior's paint. The third blank mask drifted by, pitcher in hand, moving with the cold grace of a machine performing its task. Then, the hand clamped onto Elias's elbow. It was the wrong hand. The grip was rubbery and cold, smelling faintly of latex and something sterile, like mint-flavored cleaning fluid. The white mask was inches from his face. The slit of a mouth parted, and a voice, calm, utterly bored and flat, spoke. "Party's rolling well," he observed. Sarah reacted instantly. She dug her nails into Elias's forearm and yanked him backward with a desperate strength that defied her drugged state. They slammed their shoulders down, pushing through the thickest part of the crowd. The music slowed into a heavy, viscous sludge. Someone dropped a glass bottle, and instead of a crash, the sound was muted, swallowed by the room, which collectively exhaled a low, defeated groan. Everyone was tripping, but no one yet realized they were in danger. Halfway up the main staircase, a woman dressed as Cleopatra was sitting down, mumbling incoherently. The fog machine downstairs continued its rhythmic, hellish sigh. The strobe lights fired with impossibly fast, tightening beats, like the heart of a doomed engine. "The half-bath," Sarah choked out, pointing a trembling finger toward a small door tucked beneath the eaves of the second-floor landing. They scrambled the last few steps. But just as Sarah reached the knob, the door opened, and a pale collective member, not one of the three but a fourth, stepped out, blocking the way with one stiff arm. "Staff only," he said, the same flat, bored voice. "It's a house," Sarah snapped, though her words were thick, syrupy, and slurred. His arm shifted barely an inch, a deliberate predatory dare. But they didn't engage. They simply used their remaining coherence to squeeze past him. Sarah first, Elias immediately following. They slammed the thin wooden door and fumbled the deadbolt into place. They leaned their full, heavy weight against the wood. They could hear the man pressing in from the other side. But the latch held. The bathroom was tight, suffocatingly small. The useless ceiling fan hummed overhead, stirring the air that was thick with fake cinnamon from a pumpkin candle melting in its own wax. The scent mingled sickeningly with the sweat that was now cooling on their skin. "They dosed us?" Sarah whispered, gripping the edge of the porcelain counter so hard her knuckles turned white, leaving crescent marks where her nails dug into her palm. "Fast-acting. Neurotoxin, maybe?" Elias fumbled with his phone. His fingers were useless sausages, unable to hit the required digits. He dropped it. Sarah snatched it up, her hands shaking as violently as his. But she managed to connect a call and shoved the phone back at him. 911. Address. Hold out. Just hold out. 911, what is your emergency? A calm, distant voice asked. Blackwood Manor, Elias croaked. 3616 Oakhaven Drive. Drugged. Assault. Sarah dropped the phone, clattered against the tile. The polite knock came. 2 knuckles. Soft. Insistent. Open up. Sarah pressed her entire palm flat against the deadbolt, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Go away. Her voice was barely audible. A dry, rustling chuckle came from the other side. There were no footsteps leaving, only the sound of regulated, inhuman breathing. Then the doorknob rattled. Sharp, violent, insistent. The latch groaned, but it held. Elias took her hand. It was trembling uncontrollably, the onset of a seizure. Keep quiet. We don't open. Sarah nodded, her huge, black pupils reflecting the dim candle flame. She jabbed 2 fingers at her own throat, then her teeth, then her eyes. If they get in. Throat, teeth. Whatever we got. Eyes, throat, teeth. Their new mantra. The hallway outside grew louder. A heavy, dragging sound. A muffled sob quickly cut off. A man's calm, measured voice saying, Shoo. Quiet. A chair tipped over with a loud, wooden clatter. Then, the sound of glass smashing, followed by endless, horrible laughter. These people had a plan, and it was going perfectly. Sarah pressed her forehead against Elias's. "We're not going out there." "No," Elias rasped. "We are not." The door jumped as something heavy, a shoulder, a foot, slammed against it. The lock quivered, threatening to give. Sarah stifled a scream with her fist, but her hand fell away limply, all strength gone. Elias braced his heel against the bottom of the door, knowing that whatever motor function they had left was rapidly fading. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then the assault stopped. Footsteps faded, replaced by more chaos exploding deeper in the house. Screams that cut off midstream. The sickening sound of things breaking. Elias leaned into the wall, panting. "We're okay. We're going to make it. Okay?" His lips were numb. They sat in silence, their breath sinking, listening to the terrible, distant carnival of pain outside. Crying, shouting, a huge crash, more broken glass, more laughter. "Eyes?" Sarah whispered again, her hand never leaving his. Throat, teeth. They held their ground, skin clammy, every noise outside a trigger. They could hear the pale collective moving through the house like wolves. Organized, efficient, and horrifyingly sober. Sarah squeezed his hand until his knuckles popped. "Don't let go." And he didn't. Then the air shifted. A faint, low hum beneath the chaos. Sirens. One, then two, cutting through the thick night air of Oakhaven. Blue strobes leaked through the frosted glass window, pinging them in sharp, silent flashes. The house reacted instantly. Feet thundered across the floor. Voices snapped short, sharp commands. "Go! Go! Get everything! Move!" Panicked, efficient. A crash as something was hurled through a window. Another scream, this one real, not dulled by drugs. The doorknob rattled one last time. A palm slapped flat against the wood, then sliding down with a heavy, frustrated groan. Then it was gone. "Don't move," Elias whispered, though neither of them could possibly stand. The front door burst open downstairs. Heavy boots, shouts from the police, official loud, demanding hands up. A scuffle unfolded. Running, cursing, bodies colliding. The dull, sickening sound of something slamming against drywall. Sarah pressed her face into his shoulder, muttering a prayer that was mostly just ragged breath. Then, a knock. Loud. Official. "Police. Anyone in there?" "Yes," Elias managed, the word a struggle. He fumbled with the latch, his hands stiff and half dead. The door opened to a wall of uniforms, flashlights cutting through the haze. Guns were still raised. The house was wreckage. Costumes were shredded. Furniture overturned. Unconscious, drugged bodies were scattered in grotesque piles. They pulled Elias and Sarah out. Sarah clung to him, her knees buckling. As they were helped down the stairs, Elias saw it. On the floor of the foyer, near the crimson fountain, lay an abandoned mask. White plastic, blank, but streaked with a deep, maroon red. It wasn't scary because it was a monster. It was terrifying because it was nothing. No expression. No humanity. A void. An EMT wrapped a thermal blanket around Elias's shoulders. Another officer helped stabilize Sarah. Elias couldn't answer their questions. He could only stare at that mask as they bagged it for evidence. The official story would eventually be simple. A drug ring, career criminals taking advantage of Halloween cover. But as the police lifted the bodies and the cleanup began, Elias saw what they missed. On the damp, cracked plaster of the wall where the collective had stood, there were faint, shimmering trails of silver-gray residue, already beginning to dissolve in the morning light. It was a trace, a signature of something that had not merely run away, but had retreated. Elias looked at Sarah, still shaking, and knew one thing. They hadn't fought criminals. They had stumbled into a ritual, and the hunter had failed to catch his prey. Chapter 2. The Moulded Face and the Thinning Veil. 2 weeks. Elias Thorne had spent the intervening 14 days staring at the plaster in his shared apartment, seeing only faint, shimmering trails of silver-gray residue. He had reported the incident at Blackwood Manor twice, once to the local Oakhaven PD, who patted his hand and mumbled about synthetic opioids, and once to Sarah's cousin, a low-level contact in federal law enforcement, who simply told Elias to stop calling. Sarah, still recovering from the neurotoxin, was convinced she had been delusional. She remembered the sheer terror but dismissed the blank masks and the organized culling as a psychotic episode triggered by the poison. It was a bad trip, Elle. You saw what you wanted to see, monsters. Elias knew better. The official narrative was simple, clean, and utterly wrong. The official story had no room for the pale collective, no explanation for the surgical precision of their operation, and certainly no reason why he felt like a deer that had simply been allowed to escape the slaughterhouse. He had failed to catch the prey, but the prey had definitely marked him. He needed a distraction, something loud and brightly lit. He found temporary work at the annual Oakhaven Autumn Festival, a tradition meant to celebrate the harvest but which always felt, to Elias, like a deliberate, desperate attempt to drown out the town's somber history. You're supposed to be watching the generator, Thorne, not having an existential crisis, a voice barked. It was Marco Reyes, a burly, good-natured student whom Elias knew from the architecture department. Marco was dressed in a volunteer's neon orange vest, which clashed violently with his fake lumberjack beard. Elias pulled his gaze from the flickering fluorescent tube above the funnel cake stand. Sorry. Just thinking the generator is suspiciously quiet. It's not haunted, Elle. It's a 7,500-watt commercial rental. Now focus. I need $5, and I swear I saw the best corndog of my life at booth 3. The festival was a carnival of synthetic cheer. Parents gripped toddlers dressed as tiny pumpkins. Teenagers queued for hayrides that promised manufactured scares. The scent of caramel apples, roasting nuts, and deep-fried dough hung heavy in the damp afternoon air, battling the omnipresent, bone-chilling mist that Oakhaven seemed to exhale constantly. But even under the garish fluorescent banners and the repetitive, folksy music, the historical gloom persisted. Elias noticed the subtle lack of joy. It was compliance, not revelry. He kept his head down, but his senses were stretched thin, honed by trauma. He didn't look for hooded figures or blank masks. He looked for patterns. He looked for the moment when the chaos became controlled. He found it near the artisanal soap booth. Marco, Elias said, his voice flat and low. Tell me what you see at the end of the food line, by the prize wall. Marco squinted through the throng. A guy juggling fire, a creepy clown selling balloons, and, oh hey, look at the masks on those dudes. There were 3 of them again. But this was different. They weren't wearing the smooth, sterile plastic blank masks. Their attire was the same dark, cheap hoodies that covered everything. But their faces were now encased in something heavier, more primitive. They were wearing molded faces. The masks were rough, fibrous, like they were made of damp papier-mâché or cheap plaster dipped in glue and left to dry unevenly. They were a chalky, sickly gray color, pitted and cracked in places. The cracks weren't painted. They looked like the surface of dry, sun-baked earth. They had the same blank, featureless appearance, but where the plastic had been null, this was organic. It suggested decay, fungus, something that had grown in the dark. And the way they moved. They weren't walking. They were moving with a strange, stiff-legged glide. Their hips locked, taking short, precise steps that made their bodies seem to hover just above the ground. It was an unnatural gait. Too rigid for humans, too slow for robots, like watching a poorly animated clay figure being pushed across a table. Their long arms hung limp at their sides, occasionally swinging out in an uncontrolled, jerking, asynchronous motion, like broken pendulums. Marco whistled low. Dude, that's commitment to costume. They look like they're having a collective seizure. Look closer, Elias urged, his throat tight. They're not looking at anything. They're just drifting. The three molded faces drifted slowly toward a crowded section near the petting zoo, where a young woman in a bulky winter coat was struggling to keep hold of her daughter. The daughter, maybe 4 years old, was dressed as a little ghost, her white sheet draped unevenly over her head. The mother, preoccupied with adjusting the sheet and fumbling for change, didn't see the collective approaching. Suddenly, the collective's movements changed. They stopped their aimless drift. They began to converge slowly with chilling intent, boxing the woman and the child into the narrow space between a stack of empty hay bales and a temporary fencing panel. The mother looked up, startled. "Excuse me? Could you?" she began, frowning at the three silent, gray figures now inches from her. The tallest molded face reached out, not grabbing, not attacking, but simply extending a long, gangly arm. His hand pointed toward the little girl's face. It was a gesture of acquisition. The mother shrieked, a high, panicked sound lost instantly in the festival din. She shoved the child violently behind her legs. "They're not messing around, Marco. Now," Elias hissed, dropping his radio. "They're just drunk idiots," Marco argued, but his face had gone pale as he saw the unnatural stillness of the figures. "No, they're not. Let's go." Elias charged, Marco slower to react, following a half-step behind. Elias was fueled by a cold, surgical fury. He was going to catch his prey this time. He slammed his shoulder into the closest figure, the one with the extended arm, hitting him with the force of 2 weeks of sleepless anxiety. The impact felt wrong. It wasn't soft or flexible like a human body. It was hard, dense, and instantly bruised Elias's shoulder bone. The figure didn't stumble. It simply slid 3 feet along the ground, regaining its footing instantly, like a weight on a lubricated track. It never lost balance. It was horrifyingly stable. Elias scrambled back, heart hammering against his ribs. The mother was hysterical, dragging her daughter and trying to find an exit in the fenced-off area. The three molded faces were now fully alert, their blank, pitted eyes fixed on Elias and Marco. The crowd, dense but oblivious, pressed around the edges of the confrontation, thinking it was some kind of elaborate street performance or a prank gone wrong. Marco, recovering quickly, grabbed the second figure from behind, trying to pull him back. "Hey, enough! Back off, man!" The figure didn't fight back in the conventional sense. Instead, his body went completely rigid. Marco tried to pivot, but the figure remained perfectly vertical, a dead weight anchored to the ground. Marco strained, trying to wrestle him down. Then, the second figure did it. The head turn. Without moving his shoulders, his hips, or his torso even an inch, the molded face rotated his head slowly, impossibly 180 degrees, so that the gray fungal surface was staring directly backward at Marco, right over his own shoulder. Marco didn't scream. He made a sound Elias had never heard. A dry, choked hiccup of pure, immediate psychological rupture. He instantly released his hold, stumbling backward as if kicked in the solar plexus. Marco! Elias was already engaging the first figure. He aimed a vicious kick at the man's knee, hoping to shatter the joint and prove the man was human. The pale collective member barely flinched. He simply lifted one arm, the one Elias had seen earlier, and slapped Elias across the chest. The force wasn't bone-breaking, but the sensation was terrifying. It was a pure kinetic shove, delivered with the flat, impersonal power of a hydraulics press. Elias felt his breath explode from his lungs as he was flung back into the hay bales. The third molded face, perhaps sensing the police would be called soon, reached for the little girl again. The mother screamed and bit the collective member's gloved hand, tearing the thin fabric. The figure hissed, a dry, rattling sound like paper rubbed against itself. He snatched his hand back. Then, in a fit of sudden, violent motion, he tore at his own face, aiming to rip the obstacle out of the way. The mask shattered. It wasn't a clean break. The rough, gray papier-mâché mask splintered, tearing away from the chin and cheekbone, exposing what lay beneath. It wasn't a human face. It was a substance, thick, moist, and chalk gray, adhering to the contours of the skull. It looked like ancient, compacted mold or fine cement mixed with dirt, dried and then softened again by humidity. It had a texture like heavy-duty blotting paper, but underneath the surface, Elias could see faint, pulsating veins of silver gray, the same residue he had seen 2 weeks prior. The exposed skin was featureless, doughy, but it was alive, a biological disguise fused to whatever skeletal structure was underneath. The figure made a guttural, wet sound and quickly brought his hand back to cover the broken area, like a modesty gesture. "Run! Go!" Elias screamed, adrenaline overriding the shock. Marco, still staggering, grabbed the mother and child and began pulling them violently through the crowd, shouting warnings that were quickly ignored. Elias threw a plastic bucket full of caramel apples at the molded face with the shattered mask. The bucket hit the figure squarely in the chest. The three figures looked at one another, a silent exchange that was more chilling than any spoken command. They seemed to conclude, the resource is compromised. Mission is failed. They didn't run. They moved toward the temporary metal fencing, a 4-foot-high, chain-link barrier separating the festival from the darkened forest edge. Elias watched in horrified fascination as the first figure reached the fence. He didn't climb. He didn't jump. He simply began to slide through the diamond-shaped links. His body seemed to compress, his rigid frame flattening to an impossible, slender width, his head, molded face and all, effortlessly squeezing between the wires. It was horrifyingly smooth, like thick black liquid pouring through a sieve. The second and third followed, their movements no longer stiff, but now fluid and snake-like, their spines seeming to invert and twist as they poured themselves through the impossible gaps. In seconds, they were gone, melting into the gray, tangled undergrowth of the Oakhaven woods. Elias stared at the fence, at the metal that was still faintly vibrating, unable to believe what his eyes had just processed. The police were finally coming, sirens wailing, having been alerted by a terrified Marco. The commotion had drawn a small, confused crowd. "What did you see, son?" asked a tired-looking Oakhaven deputy named Officer Doyle, his flashlight beam shaky. Elias was still breathing hard, trying to reconcile the laws of physics with the image of a man folding himself into a wire mesh. They tried to grab the kid. They were wearing masks. They ran into the woods. "Masks, huh?" Doyle sighed, clicking his tongue. "It's Halloween, son. They'll be long gone." He wrote down a description of 3 men in black hoodies, which Elias knew was useless. He turned back to Marco, who was holding the crying mother and the silent, tiny girl. "Are you okay, Marco? What did you see?" Marco's eyes were wide, vacant. He shook his head slowly, staring at the ground. "I don't know, El. I don't know what I saw. I don't know how how it did that." He was broken. The shock had been physical. Elias knelt beside the little girl. She was nestled safely in her mother's arms. Her ghost sheet askew. Her name was Lily. She wasn't crying, which was the most unsettling part. She looked at Elias with huge, dark eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen too much, and whispered, her voice barely a breath. "They wanted my skin." Elias froze. "What? They wanted my skin?" she repeated, her gaze drifting toward the woods, toward the point where the collective had dissolved. "They said it was time for me to wear the new suit." A wave of utter dread washed over Elias. It wasn't about drugs, rituals, or crime. It was about replacement. The mother, desperate to soothe her child, hushed her gently. "Silly goose. It's just a bad dream." But Elias knew it wasn't a dream. The remainder of the festival was an exercise in silence. The police did their rounds, took statements, and drove away, satisfied with the public disturbance and possible attempted kidnapping report. Marco went home immediately, pale and refusing to speak. As the sun fully set and the orange lights came on, the cheerful atmosphere didn't return. The crowd, those who had seen the figures or witnessed the aftermath, didn't chatter excitedly about the crazy masked guys. Instead, they packed up their families, folded their chairs, and left in absolute, oppressive silence. They walked slowly, their eyes darting nervously toward the treeline. They avoided eye contact. They did not speak of what they had seen, not out of fear of official reprisal, but out of a deeper, more profound terror. It was the collective, unspoken fear that if you named the thing that had glided, if you described the head that had spun, if you acknowledged the gray, fungal face under the broken shell, you would become the next candidate for the new suit. Elias stood alone by the generator, the noise now a grating interruption in the heavy silence. He looked at the festival, now half empty, and felt the thinning of the veil. Oakhaven wasn't just paying penance for its history. It was preparing for its next transaction. And he realized the horrible implication of the molded face. The Pale Collective wasn't just recruiting. It was replacing. Chapter 3. The Price of Recklessness. The two incidents, the Blackwood Manor culling and the festival replacement attempt, had not broken Elias Thorne, but they had fundamentally rewired him. He no longer saw Oakhaven as merely quaint and historically dark. He saw it as an active, festering infection, and he knew he carried the spores. Halloween night, 1 year after the first attack, was not a celebration for Elias. It was a deployment. He wasn't the cynical vampire hunter this year. He was simply the guardian. His costume was an intentional camouflage. A generic, dark coat, boots, and a baseball cap pulled low, less for disguise, more for observation. His focus was not on himself, but on the two people he was responsible for. His younger twin cousins, Lena and Finn. Lena, 16, was dressed ironically as a medieval plague doctor, her mask absurdly long and beaked. Finn, also 16, was a modern zombie, more interested in his phone than his shambling gait. They were visiting from out of state and saw Oakhaven as a perfect, spooky backdrop for their social media feeds. Elias saw it as a feeding ground. "We're going to hit the town square for the last hour," Elias instructed, his voice low and firm, as they moved through the crowded main street. "Stay within 5 feet of me. No punch. No drinks from strangers. Anything looks wrong, you run home. No questions." Lena rolled her eyes, but the glint of real fear in her eyes told him she respected the warning. Elias had never been the overprotective cousin before Oakhaven. His plan was simple but desperate. He needed to meet his only ally. Sarah, having finally believed Elias when she began seeing faint, recurring silver streaks in her periphery, had been researching the town's hidden lore. She was currently out of state but had sent a courier, Marco, who was still traumatized but fiercely loyal, with a package. The alley, Elias. Behind the old bookstore. 10 minutes. Marco's text read. Elias glanced at the twins. I need to duck into an ATM. Stay right here, watch the corner. He didn't wait for a reply, using the cover of a passing group of costumed revelers to slip down a side street toward the alley. The cold, wet stone beneath his boots felt like the only solid thing in Oakhaven. Marco was there, leaning against the damp brick wall, looking skeletal in the ambient orange light. He wasn't in costume. He was just wearing clothes that looked too big for him. You're late, Marco whispered, his voice cracking. He held out a small, heavy ceramic flask, sealed with thick, black wax. It's not what you think. It's old. Sarah found the cipher. It's a localized repellent. She thinks the silver mold hates the minerals in it. Elias grabbed the flask, tucking the cold ceramic deep into his inner coat pocket. And you trust this? I trust Sarah's fear, Marco replied simply. It's the only real thing left in this town. Before Elias could ask more, a sound cut through the noise of the main street. A low, resonant howl. It was not a celebratory shout, not a cry of pain, but a sustained, inhuman expression of pure, targeted rage. Marco's eyes went wide. That's not costumed. Elias knew the sound instantly. It wasn't the flat, bored hum of the Pale Collective. It was the sound of a human being pushed far past his breaking point, the sound of the mold taking a host. A moment later, a figure burst into the alley. He was dressed in a tattered leather jacket and jeans, looking like a street vagrant, not a costumed reveler. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely black in the center, devoid of any discernible white. Saliva frothed at his lips, and he moved not with the gliding stiffness of the collective, but with the jerking, unpredictable violence of a marionette whose strings had been cut by a maniac. He was screaming. The sound was not English. It was a string of harsh, grating consonants and guttural vowels, an ancient language that seemed to vibrate the fillings in Elias's teeth. It sounded like the core vocabulary of madness. Get out! Elias roared at Marco, pushing him back. Marco needed no second urging. He scrambled into the street and vanished. The mad attacker lunged at Elias, not aiming for a punch, but for a bite. Elias sidestepped the attack. The attacker slammed his hand against the brick wall, leaving deep, ragged gouges in the mortar. That's when Elias saw the hands. The fingernails weren't manicured, but they weren't just dirty either. They were long, thick, and stained a deep, unhealthy black-brown, curving into sharp points like natural claws. They were actively growing, pushing out past the quick. The Pale Collective wasn't just replacing, it was mutating. Elias, utilizing his architectural training, how to use leverage, how to find the structural weakness in a frame, knew he couldn't fight raw strength. He had to be evasive. He dodged a wild swipe and shoved his boot into the back of the attacker's knee, not to injure, but to disrupt his center of gravity. The man fell, thrashing on the wet pavement. He screamed the ancient words again, a sound of absolute, joyous cruelty. Elias didn't wait. His objective wasn't to capture, but to protect the twins. He vaulted over the screaming man and sprinted back toward the main street. He found them exactly where he had left them, but the area was now deserted. The main crowd had thinned rapidly, leaving only a few stragglers who were hurrying home. And standing between him and the twins was the mad attacker. He had somehow moved through the labyrinthine streets faster than Elias. The twins were huddled by the storefront. Lena's plague doctor mask knocked off her head, revealing a face frozen in terror. Finn had finally dropped his phone. The mad attacker was lumbering toward them. The streetlights above flickered violently, struggling against the unnatural night. "Get behind me!" Elias shouted, throwing himself forward. He didn't have the luxury of strategy now. He had to block. He positioned himself between the attacker and the twins, spreading his arms wide. The attacker didn't hesitate. He changed his trajectory, focusing entirely on Elias, seeing him as the only obstacle. He lunged, a desperate, final rush. Elias tried to use the ceramic flask as a makeshift weapon, swinging it at the attacker's head. The attacker grabbed Elias's forearm with one of his clawed hands. The grip was shockingly cold, like handling a piece of iron left out in the snow, and impossibly strong. Elias felt the bones in his forearm grate together. The attacker pulled Elias close, ignoring the flask, ignoring the pain. His black eyes, inches from Elias's own, weren't insane. They were deliberate. A sudden, horrific calm descended over the man's face, replacing the frenzy. The mouth opened wide, wider than it should have, and the attacker sank his teeth into Elias's shoulder, right where the coat had been pulled taut, tearing through the fabric and sinking deep into the flesh beneath. Elias screamed, a sound that finally ripped through the silence of the night. It wasn't a scream of fear, but of absolute, shocking violation. He brought the ceramic flask down with all his remaining strength, smashing it against the attacker's temple. The flask didn't shatter. The heavy ceramic cracked the attacker's skull with a sickening, wet thud. The attacker immediately released his hold, stumbling backward, his hands flying up to clutch the wound. He collapsed against the street, whimpering. The frenzy was gone, replaced by sudden, overwhelming pain. Elias was on his knees, clutching his shoulder, the heavy, metallic warmth of his own blood blooming across his coat. Lena and Finn rushed to him, crying now, tearing off their costumes and trying to apply pressure to the deep, ragged wound. The police arrived then, the sound of their sirens muffled and distorted, as if passing through several layers of heavy cloth. Officer Doyle, older, heavier, and looking even more exhausted than he had 2 weeks ago, stepped out. The scene was chaos. A frantic young man bleeding profusely, 2 teenagers sobbing, and another man moaning on the ground. "What in God's name happened here?" Doyle demanded, flashlight beam slicing through the dark. Elias, eyes stinging, watched as the mad attacker was subdued and handcuffed. As the man was hauled to his feet, their eyes met across the dim street. The attacker was no longer screaming the ancient words. He was no longer writhing with rage. His face was slack, bloodied, and utterly exhausted. But he looked at Elias, at the wound, at the blood, and slowly, sickeningly, he smiled. It was a quiet smile. A slow, gentle, utterly knowing smile. It was the smile of a man who had successfully completed his final, assigned task. "Welcome to the collective, brother." The police explanation was quick, reductive, and predictable. PCP psychosis. A vagrant who had gone violently mad, assaulting citizens. They took the attacker away. They promised Elias treatment, counseling, and a quiet dismissal of the incident. But as the EMTs cleaned his wound, Elias didn't hear the police. He heard the mad attacker's smile. He refused to go to the hospital. He ordered the twins to call their parents, tell them a sanitized version of events, and stay locked in their hotel room until morning. He made his way back to his apartment, body shaking, mind cold and clear. He stripped off his coat, wincing as the blood-soaked fabric peeled away from the deep gash on his shoulder. It was a crescent-shaped bite, savage and deep. He leaned into the bathroom mirror, turning his shoulder to the harsh fluorescent light. He cleaned the wound obsessively, rinsing away the blood and the lingering traces of the attacker's saliva. The wound was deep, and it was jagged, but that wasn't what seized his breath. At the very bottom of the gash, along the clean, white edge of the tearing, just beneath the surface of his skin, he could see it. It wasn't blood clotting. It wasn't bruised tissue. It was a faint, almost invisible discoloration. A shimmering, microscopic streak of silver-gray residue, no bigger than a fine hair. It was migrating slowly outward from the deepest point of the bite, already beginning to settle and fuse with his subcutaneous layer. It pulsed faintly, like a sluggish vein that carried not blood, but mold and malice. Elias stared at his reflection, but he no longer saw the cynical student. He saw the guardian, the hunter who had tried too hard to catch his prey and had, in turn, become the new host. The Pale Collective didn't need to wear a mask to claim you. They just needed to give you the mark. Halloween was over. The night of the witch was done. But for Elias Thorne, the long, silent infection had just begun. He was the newest suit, and the collective was waiting for him to wake up.